Welcome back to the Bridgehead. If an election was held today in Canada, all the polls indicate that the federal Conservative Party under the leadership of Pierre Poilievre would win a sweeping victory. And that's one of the reasons Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is currently stacking the deck. And this is something that most people aren't actually aware of. Every prime minister gets to appoint senators whenever a seat comes up for vacancy. And some of you may remember that prior to losing office in 2015, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who was a conservative, left a whole bunch of seats empty, stating that the Senate needed to be reformed. This, I think, was a massive miscalculation because as soon as Trudeau took office, he promptly filled all of those seats. This is significant because Canada's Senate is where legislation gets sent after the legislators in Parliament vote on it. What does that mean? It means that if the House of Commons passes a law, it gets sent to the Senate for a sober second thought, so to speak, and then they can send it back to Parliament. And increasingly what we see is that Canada's Senate is stacked with radical progressive ideologues. And this is being done very, very deliberately. Just to give you an idea of how extreme Canada's Senate has become, it was actually Canada's Senate that demanded that MAID or euthanasia for mental illness be put into Canada's legislation. These people are not elected, they're appointed, they are completely unaccountable, and yet they can bog down the legislative process almost indefinitely, which means that if Pierre Poilievre is to win the next election, and again, with the polling, it looks like he probably will, he is going to be facing an incredibly hostile Senate stacked with ideologues that Justin Trudeau has chosen for the specific purpose of ensuring that his ideological legacy is still entrenched in Canada's top chamber. Just to give you an idea of how many he has appointed, there are 105 senators in Canada right now, and Justin Trudeau has thus far appointed 86 of them. Now, Justin Trudeau disbanded the Liberal caucus of the Senate in a bid to claim that he was only appointing independent senators. But the independent senators that he's been appointing adhere to almost everything he believes in a bunch of very significant areas. So I want to look at just two of his most recent appointments that give you an idea of what Trudeau is up to here and the extent to which the Senate could block any common sense social legislation coming out of the Parliament, even under a federal Conservative leadership. So one of the most recent appointees is a man named Dr. Christopher Wells. Now, some of you may recognize his name because he is one of the most notorious LGBT activists in Canada. Here is what the government website announcing his appointment to the Senate said. So this is their version of his accomplishments. Dr. Christopher Wells is an educator and champion for 2S LGBTQI+. The plus is always kind of sinister. Community who has used research and advocacy to help advance diversity, equity, and human rights in Alberta and across the country. He started his career as a teacher in St. Albert Public Schools before completing master's doctoral degrees focused on sexual and gender diversity in education. He later worked as a diversity consultant for Edmonton Public Schools, where he helped to develop the first standalone sexual orientation and gender identity school board in Western Canada. From 2012 to 2018, he was assistant professor and faculty director of the Institute for Sexual Minority Studies and Services at the University of Alberta. He then became MacEwan University's first Canada Research Chair and served as the founding director of the MacEwan Centre for Sexual and Gender Diversity. Blah, blah, blah. This basically lists off a whole laundry list of other LGBT organizations that Dr. Wells is a part of, including the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, under which most of you could presumably be prosecuted, the Edmonton Police Chiefs Community Advisory Council, ensuring that the people who are prosecuting you know where to find you, the LGBTQ plus National Monument Committee, and on it goes. I've been covering Chris Wells for a long time because Chris Wells has been one of the primary antagonists of conservative Christians in Canada for years now. I'd like to tell you what his comment on his Senate appointment was, but he's blocked me on Twitter as the result of publishing his own words. So back when Rachel Notley was Premier of Alberta, before she was replaced by Jason Kenney, you might remember that she had actually put a law in place that would have shut down 22 Christian schools if they declined to put gay-straight alliance clubs in place. In short, she was basically mandating that Christian schools could no longer be Christian schools. And she was doing this essentially at the behest of Dr. Chris Wells. Dr. Chris Wells at the time actually said, enough is enough for schools that won't comply with basic policy expectations. There need to be consequences. He was advocating that Christian schools right across the province get shut down if they did not institute gay-straight alliance clubs into those schools. Let me give you just a few other examples of the things that I've covered in the last few years about Chris Wells. He was one of the ones attacking a Calgary priest from the Roman Catholic Diocese of Calgary who had condemned homosexuality in a sermon, of course, to a Catholic audience in adherence to Catholic doctrine. And one of the things he said was that the rainbow pride flag represented lawlessness, which, of course, from a Christian Orthodox perspective is just true. And what ended up happening is that Wells went after him and claimed that, quote, these kinds of comments make it open season on LGBTQ youth, saying it's okay to openly discriminate against them. It's not fine to bring those beliefs into a public school environment. These are the kinds of comments that breed hatred, violence, and discrimination. Now, what's very significant about that is that what Chris Wells was saying here is that any articulation of Christian doctrine on the LGBT agenda constitutes open season, this is very charged terminology, on LGBTQ youth. In short, sermons that would read from any number of Bible passages or articulate what Christians have believed for 2,000 years actually constitute a hate crime and an incitement to violence on young people who identify as LGBT. This is an incredibly radical view. And while I was doing research, kind of pulling together the things that I've written about Chris Wells over the last few years, when I heard about his appointment, it turns out there's actually a petition that's already up where somebody's compiled even more details of what our newest senator believes. So he was appointed last week, and here's what the petition says. Alberta's newest senator is a gender ideology activist who disapproves of parental rights, compares Christians to Nazi murderers, and is responsible for directing children as young as 5 to sexually explicit material. Under Alberta's NDP government, which I referenced earlier, Wells, then affiliated with a group called the Institute for Sexual Minority Studies and Services, worked as the, quote, driving force behind the Alberta GSA network, an initiative directed towards minor children from kindergarten through grade 12. As a sidebar here, when I was covering this controversy in Alberta at the time, I was getting messages from parents across Alberta who were sending me photographs of the kinds of pamphlets that were being distributed by gay-straight alliance clubs. And they were so graphic that I couldn't even publish them. I couldn't even use them in articles I was writing on this because they actually had photographs, for example, of a rocket ship shaped like the male member headed towards somebody's bottom. These were things being handed out to young kids. Again, I couldn't even publish the pictures, and we won't publish the pictures here, but this is the kind of thing that the GSA network was promoting. It was designed to assist children involved in gay-straight alliances at school and featured links to various community supports. One such community support was Fruit Loop, a Facebook page full of sexually explicit content. In other words, this petition says, Dr. Wells' network allowed children to access graphic sexual material in just 2 clicks. And as I just highlighted, some of this material made it to students without any clicks at all. The material found on the page with instructions on how to reach orgasm, tips on oral sex, and ads featuring naked people who share an erotic kiss on a tennis court were all conveniently available for access by children aged 5 to 17. And so they give more details. One of, I think, his most insidious quotes on Twitter, now known as X, was him stating that so-called parental rights are a dog whistle for an explicit anti-2S LGBTQ plus agenda. This is an organized hate movement. So if you go to a church that holds to conservative Christian views on sexuality, according to Dr. Chris Wells, you are in fact part of an organized hate movement. And he is saying this explicitly. He has also long promoted childhood gender transition surgery, which is a dangerous practice that, as we'll be getting into later, has been exposed by the Cass Review and the medical establishments in many European countries as medically disreputable and objectively dangerous to kids. As Edmonton Journal columnist David Staples wrote about Wells' appointment, quote, a decade from now, the medical transitioning of young people will be viewed as a catastrophic public health scandal. Any politician who forcefully supported it will be disgraced. Maybe it's best not to have a Senate full of such people. of course, that is the case, but that's the whole reason Trudeau is putting people like Dr. Chris Wells in the Senate. Because Pierre Poilievre, for example, has already come out and stated on the record that he opposes giving puberty blockers to kids, that he opposes it. And he was forced to do so by a bunch of provincial premiers putting forward policies, but he did so nonetheless. Now, how do you think a Prime Minister, Pierre Poilievre, could respond to an increasing number of research and high court decisions and medical studies coming out of the places like UK and respond to the medical scandal going on in Canada's hospitals when that legislation, if he was to put it forward, let's say he was to put forward legislation similar to what Danielle Smith has proposed in Alberta, which bans sex change treatments for kids. What do you think a piece of legislation like that would do once it hit Canada's upper chamber, the Senate, when guys like Chris Wells are stalking those benches? That's the point, of course. Guys like Chris Wells would do their very best. They would be hell-bent on making sure that legislation like this went anywhere. These guys are Trudeau's insurance policy for making sure that his radical social agenda, which has been unbelievably extreme over the past decade, remains enshrined regardless of what Pierre Poilievre can be convinced to do on the social front. And it's not just Chris Wells either. I started going through a list of senators, and some of these guys, you've got one guy who was the head of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, and in that capacity received an award in part for his support of the LGBTQ community. Clearly a bigot, because my understanding from Wells here is that it's 2QLs plus whatever. But clearly that guy's award was truncated. But there's another appointee, Charles Adler. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of Charles Adler, but he started off as a conservative of sorts. He was a radio host in BC and Alberta, and then he was on Sun News Network for a little while. Sun News Network was called Fox News North and only survived a couple of years, in part due to the lack of talent displayed by guys like Adler. The funniest clip Sun News Network ever did actually was where Charles Adler got fired on the air on his own show by Corey Tenike, who was running it. It's a great video clip if you're ever in a bad mood. He has just also been appointed an independent senator from Alberta. And this guy has completed a complete transformation over the last couple of years. He's hardcore progressive on every single social issue. He got most famous for going after Jason Kenney and accusing him of being a homophobic bigot, for declining to support things like gay-straight alliances. And he's been very vocal about Trudeau's two pet issues, which are abortion and the LGBT agenda. In one particularly insidious moment, he actually referred to Arnold Viersen, the MP from Peace River Westlock in Alberta, who is one of Parliament's best combatants of sex trafficking. He's put forward stuff to research the connections between porn and sex trafficking. He's done brilliant stuff in partnership even with Liberal senators on human trafficking and pornography. He's actually lauded as a key ally by groups that are fighting to free victims of human trafficking, despite the fact that he's very conservative. And he's also the head of the Parliamentary Pro-Life Caucus. Well, Charles Adler at one point referred to Arnold Viersen as trash. And I wrote an entire article on this because Charles Adler, referring to this MP as trash, although he did once refer to senators as whores as well. So it's interesting to see him joining the Senate with that in mind. Perhaps he felt that he would fit in. But essentially, he's calling an MP who's working on legislation and has worked on several pieces of legislation trash. You expect this guy to work well with a conservative caucus? Of course not. Trudeau doesn't expect him to work well with a conservative caucus at all. He doesn't expect him to play nice. He expects Charles Adler to treat conservative MPs like trash, which is why he got appointed. Just to give you an idea of how Adler views the average Canadian Christian, when he was interrogating Jason Kenney on his boring Christian and Catholic views, he actually asked Jason Kenney to disavow all of the knuckle draggers that still believed in the Christian view of sexuality. So you've got Chris Wells, who essentially believes any church is a organized hate movement if that church is conservative and not run by a lesbian Anglican clergywoman. And you have not Michael Corrin, pardon me, Freudian slip. He's pretty terrible too. I'm sure he's going to be a senator imminently. Then you've got Charles Adler. Charles Adler is referring to people like yourselves as knuckle draggers. When Trudeau sent out an attack ad on gender ideology, attacking Poilievre on his position that, by the way, conforms to the Labour Party's position in the UK, Charles Adler tweeted out the ad, and this is what he seethed. Quote, Canada's conservative leader, who wants to be PM when he grows up, is an impersonation of the moral basement dwellers populating Republican America. So, according to the most recent senators appointed by Justin Trudeau, we are moral basement dwellers, knuckle draggers, and part of an organized hate movement. And this guy appointed 81% of Canada's current senators. These are the people that he is putting in charge. They are unelected, unaccountable, and I think that we have to recognize the fact that if Pierre Poilievre gets elected, which looks likely right now, regardless of how many small C conservative MPs he has, regardless of Poilievre's willingness to actually pass legislation, say banning euthanasia for mental illness, banning sex change surgeries for minors, regardless of what a conservative caucus is going to try and do, Justin Trudeau has put a cork in the process, and that cork is in the place of men like Chris Wells, like Charles Adler, and I've only Googled a list of these people. In fact, they actually have what they call the Progressive Senate Group, that a lot of them, they get together and they discuss their commitment to progressive ideals. And so I think we need to be aware that in this country, the way our system is set up right now, Justin Trudeau may no longer be prime minister, but one of his legacies is going to be stacking both the Senate and the judiciary with hardcore LGBT activist people who are going to do their very best to make sure Trudeau's Canada carries on long after he's gone. Now let's take a look at the fiercest debate going on in the United States. And what's interesting about what's going on this election season, which has been changing from week to week at an almost staggering pace, is that you're actually seeing a bit of an internecine fight going on the American right. Most of you will have observed, if you're passionate about the pro-life issue like I am, that Donald Trump has been steadily moving away from the pro-life movement, especially over the last couple of months. I wrote an essay for First Things magazine where I interviewed a delegate to the Republican National Convention, and she essentially described how pro-life leaders were railroaded, that the process was set up ahead of time. Pro-life delegates were surrounded by people who were there just to ensure that they couldn't ask questions and that they could instead just vote for the platform as presented. And although delegates thought early in July that they'd be spending a couple of days going over the RNC platform as they did in previous years, instead they were given orientation on Sunday night and everybody was back out on the sidewalk before noon. And most significantly, this was the very first platform that removed the pro-life plank that had been in the platform since 1984. And that plank explicitly recognized that the unborn have a right to life. That plank is gone. And in its place was some very anemic language opposing late-term abortion and actually expressing in the same sentence support for in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization, of course, being a process in which thousands upon thousands of preborn human beings die every single year. And this language was removed very deliberately. This was a pivot by the RNC away from the pro-life movement. It was abandoning all of the previous pro-life principles that had been laid out in the 2016 platform. I was actually in Ohio with pro-life leaders at the last RNC. Pro-lifers got everything that they asked for. This was a huge change. Most of the pro-life leaders still signed on to the platform. They released a statement of support because of very vague 14th Amendment language that indicated perhaps that states could protect preborn children. But Donald Trump has been moving steadily away from the pro-life movement even further since then. So a lot of pro-lifers, although they tried to influence the process, even though many of them were kind of cut out of the process, swallowed hard and said, okay, I guess this is the best we can get. This is what we're going to take. Well, things have changed a lot since then, and I know a lot of people find this very controversial, so let me kind of go step by step through the various positions Trump has taken on abortion since early July, because I think it's really important to understand the extent to which there is a massive chasm between the pro-life agenda and a presidential candidate who is now coming out and essentially proactively affirming that he's pro-choice. So during the Biden-Trump debate, as it turns out the first and last Trump-Biden debate, Trump actually affirmed his support for access to the abortion pill. I thought at first maybe he didn't know what he was talking about. Trump is frequently not very well briefed on Supreme Court decisions. Maybe he wasn't sure what he was affirming support for, but J.D. Vance came out subsequently and also affirmed support for access to the abortion pill. 60% of abortions in the U.S. are now done by the abortion pill. So looking at a couple of other positions. So Following the abortion-themed Democratic Convention, and most of you will know that the Democratic Convention pivoted to the left hard on abortion. There was even a mobile Planned Parenthood clinic a couple of blocks away from the convention where 25 babies were killed. But Trump responded to this not by drawing a contrast between the Democrats and his own positions, or even emphasizing late-term abortion. Instead, he announced on Truth Social, which is his social media site, on August 23, that his administration would be, quote, great for women and their reproductive rights. And reproductive rights, of course, is a euphemism used for abortion. On August 25, J.D. Vance told NBC's Meet the Press that Trump would veto a national abortion ban if it came across his desk. It's important to point out here that when we're talking about an abortion ban, a national abortion ban, the only ban that's even been floated was put forward by GOP Senator Lindsey Graham, who suggested there be a 15-week cutoff, which is 3 weeks later than almost any European country. That means the United States would still be far more liberal in the gestational limit for abortion than most European countries. And that's why Graham, who's a pretty squishy pro-choice guy, picked 15 weeks because he figured this would be a good compromise bill. J.D. Vance now affirming that this would get vetoed. On August 29, Trump announced that, quote, under the Trump administration, your government will pay for, or your insurance company will be mandated to pay for all costs associated with IVF treatment. This is actually a commitment to expand the culture of death and would result in the deaths of thousands of embryos, human beings in the earliest stage. And this is something that a lot of pro-lifers and conservatives pointed out right away. This is just as bad as Obamacare's birth control mandate, which Christians fought the Obama administration in court time and time again. But almost dead silence from most conservatives on Trump's move here. So most pro-life activists are kind of banking on this idea that Trump, when he gets elected, if he gets elected, is going to govern like he did in his first term, when he signed off on an RNC platform packed with all kinds of pro-life agenda items, when he was surrounded by all kinds of hardcore pro-life people like Vice President Mike Pence, who actually got involved in politics over the abortion issue and was the pro-life movement's man in the White House. I've talked to pro-life groups that were associated with the Trump administration, and they said Pence would be pushing those priorities over and over and over again. The early days of the first Trump administration were incredibly chaotic, but you had a couple of people in the administration that knew that they wanted to use this administration to further pro-life policies, and they got those pro-life policies. It's important to remember that even the justices that we got from Trump are largely due to so-called swamp creatures like Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who held open Antonin Scalia's seat for months so that Obama couldn't fill it. That gave us Neil Gorsuch. And Mitch McConnell phoned Donald Trump immediately after Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away and said, we're going to fill this seat, and we're going to fill this seat with Amy Coney Barrett, even though the election is right around the corner. And so Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence and a lot of these GOP leaders get a lot of flack, but the reality is that Roe v. Wade was overturned and all these pro-life gains were actually achieved because of people who aren't Donald Trump, although to his great credit, he allowed himself to be used for pro-life purposes. His son, Eric Trump, has now affirmed, however, that he was pro-choice all along, which is something that I very much suspected. Donald Trump was a pro-abortion liberal for his entire career, and then leading up to the presidential election in 2016, he adopted a bunch of pro-life talking points, a bunch of pro-life policies. There was negotiations with the pro-life movement over what he would support. That was fantastic. He met with pro-life leaders after the Indiana primary, where Ted Cruz, who was the last remaining pro-life pick, kind of dropped out, and he agreed he would do all these different things in exchange for support, and we got it. But it was a huge mistake to call him the most pro-life president in American history, because that meant you were pro-life if you acted in political self-interest, if you were willing to sign off on a list of policies, but that has nothing to do with what you actually believe, whether or not you were genuinely and sincerely pro-life. And at the RNC, when Eric Trump was doing an interview, he actually told the press, my father isn't really pivoting. He's always been there. When they asked him why Trump was pivoting towards a more moderate position on abortion, he affirmed, my dad has always been pro-choice. And so those who haven't believed it from me, I've written essay after essay on this, explaining how Trump got us pro-life policies, but that was largely due to those he was surrounded with. It was largely due to business deals that he cut. He wasn't a pro-life person out of conviction. And now his son has confirmed that he is, in fact, pro-choice. So if you can't take it from me, hopefully you can take it from him. I think it's important that we disabuse people of the notion, though, that his next administration, if he were to be reelected, is going to be anything like his first administration. Because first of all, we see a lot of the very pro-life, socially conservative people are no longer in the loop. We know that pro-life leaders and pro-life activists have been cut out. We know this because of the RNC process, where pro-life delegates were identified and cut out and replaced with other people. And the pro-life leaders who were there, people like Tony Perkins, people like Gail Ruzick, were cut out of the process and were essentially shut up by the chair of the RNC, Senator Marsha Blackburn, when they tried to register protest about how the procedure was going. So we already see that things are very, very different. But what was really interesting is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is, he's a pro-abortion Democrat, and he recently endorsed Donald J. Trump. And it's very strange to me how many Republicans are enthusiastic about this, because having a very pro-abortion guy as part of the Trump administration fills me with concern, because I want pro-life policies. At very minimum, I'd like him not to advocate for pro-abortion policies, for reproductive rights, as he said after the DNC. And here's what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. actually told somebody in an interview, and this was kind of going viral on Twitter, but he noted that he would be part of a Trump transition team, he and Tulsi Gabbard, another former Democrat who was also pro-choice, and that they would be assisting Trump in picking who will govern, and that, quote, people are going to see a very different President Trump than they did last term. He said many interesting things to me about what he did wrong last time. Specifically, RFK Jr. noted Trump regretted those he surrounded himself with previously. And he said this, quote, Trump said, they're always bringing this up to me and telling me I'm for Project 2025. I'd never read it till they started accusing me of it. That was written by some right-wing asshole, is what he said to me. He's listening to a wider range of voices. Project 2025 was put together by a bunch of conservative intellectuals and activists, and it was kind of a roadmap for how Trump could root out the deep state and implement conservative governance policies. But when the Democrats accused Trump of being associated with it, he not only repudiated it, he ran against it. He called it harsh and extreme, which, as you'll recall, is exactly what he's been doing with pro-life policies, is he's been accusing states that have pro-life policies like 6-week bans, states like Iowa, states like Florida, and he's been calling them harsh and extreme, which is straight up Planned Parenthood language. He's essentially agreeing with the Democrats that protecting preborn human rights in the early stages are very, very extreme. So this range of voices that Trump is saying he wants to listen to have really narrowed, and a lot of pro-life leaders have found themselves out in the cold. Now, I have been long worried, and I wrote this in a couple of columns for First Things, that Trump might weigh in on the abortion side of the upcoming referendums in November. There's all these state-level referendums where the voters are going to vote directly on abortion, vote directly on enshrining abortion into state constitutions, and Trump's trajectory was very, very concerning, and I was worried that if he decides that he has to throw the pro-life movement completely under the bus, that this is what he's going to do. And that's what happened on August 29. An NBC reporter asked Trump about Amendment 4, the Right to Abortion Initiative, which is on the November ballot in Florida. Amendment 4, just so you know, would enshrine abortion up until birth in the Florida Constitution. And just to highlight that, let me read you what it says. Quote, no law shall prohibit, penalize, delay, or restrict abortion before viability or when necessary to protect the patient's health as determined by the patient's healthcare provider. And in response to that question, Trump said, I think the 6-week ban is too short. There has to be more time. That is, more time for a woman to get an abortion. I've told them I want more weeks. I'm going to be voting that we leave more than 6 weeks. Now, I emphasize that last line because there's been a bunch of MAGA activists coming out in line saying he never said he'd vote for Amendment 4. He just reiterated his position that 6 weeks was too early to ban abortion. But the reality is that he said, I'm going to be voting that we leave more than 6 weeks. I'm not sure how anybody listening in good faith can actually claim that he wasn't indicating how he was voting, because you might notice the word voting is in that sentence. And so all the MAGA activists desperately trying to cover up for what Trump is actually saying, that's just garbage because he said the word voting. Now, fortunately, pro-life activists ramped it up. And again, this is that internecine sort of inter-right civil war that erupted that I referred to, is you had some pro-life activists come out, some pro-life leaders saying, we need to see a change here. Kristen Hawkins of Students for Life of America, Lila Rose of Live Action, quite a number of other pro-life leaders were coming out and saying, this is a disaster. Trump could actually cost us the Florida referendum. It needs 60% of the votes to pass. The pro-life movement had recently pushed it down to below the 60% threshold threshold. The last poll, I believe it said 58%. But if Republican voters decided to follow Trump to consider this extreme and vote against it, Trump would be directly responsible for influencing a vote that would result in thousands of preborn babies dying. And so I was tweeting about this. A whole bunch of other pro-lifers were tweeting about this. Some pro-life leaders were tweeting about this. And what's interesting is that instantly these MAGA guys, the Make America Great Again activists who are Trump personality cultists, came out and said, you need to shut up. You need to get in line. If Trump doesn't get elected, our country's going to burn. Frank Pavone of Priests for Life, who used to be really solid on this issue, actually came out and said, abortion is basically a peripheral issue in this election. What we need right now is a firefighter because the house is on fire. We'll deal with the abortion issue later, which is just something that I fundamentally disagree with. Now, what happened next highlights the fact that pro-life leaders need to be pushing back right now because pro-life pressure worked. On August 30, Trump changed his mind, and he reiterated this in several interviews, starting with an interview with Fox News, saying that he still opposes a 6-week abortion ban, but that he would be voting against Amendment 4. Quote, the Democrats are radical because the 9 months is just a ridiculous situation where you can do an abortion in the 9th month, he said. You know, some of the states like Minnesota have it where you can actually execute the baby after birth, and all of that stuff is unacceptable, so I'll be voting no for that reason. So both internal reports, internal sources, and press coverage indicates that Trump retracted that previous statement because of pro-life backlash, which highlights how essential it is for pro-lifers to push during this narrow period between now and Election Day where Trump needs our votes. Because there's a lot of swing states where there are only a couple of points between the Trump Vance ticket and the Harris-Walz ticket. And social conservatives could make a difference. I know a lot of pro-lifers who have said, well, I can't vote for this guy. If he's going to vote for abortion up until birth in Florida, this is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And there's a lot of personality cult, MAGA people online saying things like, well, nobody's saying that they would vote against Trump just over this issue. Then listen to other podcasters like Allie Beth Stuckey, who have said, I'm trying to convince all kinds of sort of church ladies and Christian moms in my audience to vote for Trump. But every statement he makes pushes them farther away from Trump. I know a lot of people who are doing write-in, who are voting third party. Trump has to give pro-lifers reason to vote for him like he did last time. And so this walk back is evidence that pro-life pressure can be effective, and it means that pro-lifers shouldn't shut up. The MAGA activists telling them to shut up should close their mouths and realize that this is a really, really important time in American history and a very important time in American political history. Very important, because Trump is not the answer to everything. And in fact, if what happens is that we have a choice between two pro-choice parties, if what we end up having is a radical pro-abortion Democratic Party, and we have a Republican Party that only opposes late-term abortion at best, that would put the American pro-life movement in the same position as the Canadian pro-life movement or the French pro-life movement or the British pro-life movement, which means that none of the major parties actually support the pro-life movement, making it almost impossible to get laws supporting the pro-life position and opposing abortion. And what this also means is it becomes a political no man's land. It becomes a political no-go zone where nobody's willing to stick their neck out, and it becomes normal not to talk about it. It becomes normal to accept abortion. What has made America different over the last 50 years is one of their parties has always affirmed the ideal that preborn children should be protected in the womb. It's already retracted that ideal quite a bit in the latest RNC platform. But if Trump successfully turns the Republican Party of the United States into the Conservative Party of Canada, or the Conservative Party in the UK, or the right-wing parties, for example, in either Germany or France, essentially what this means is the best hope that the pro-life movement has for achieving protections for preborn children in the long term is gone. I understand this is a state-level issue. I understand that in most cases, this is going to be state-level pro-life groups working from door to door, from neighborhood to neighborhood, changing public opinion. We work with all kinds of groups like that, Created Equal in Ohio, Protect Life Michigan. In Michigan, these are phenomenal groups doing that work. But what we need right now is not for Trump to campaign on the pro-life platform, but not to campaign against it, not to positively affirm both the rhetoric and the agenda of the abortion activists all the time. He there needs to be daylight between Trump and Planned Parenthood. And the MAGA activists telling pro-lifers to shut up need to recognize that the only reason he changed his mind is because people pushed back. If we listen to the advice of people like, unfortunately, even Frank Pavone, we would essentially be leaving the status quo as it was. We would be leaving Trump's statement on Amendment 4 as it was. And he would not have said a word. He would not have backtracked if he hadn't been forced to. And for those, again, who say, well, he just clarified his position. Well, you may have missed the word voting in his previous statement, but he said he would be voting that there be more than 6 weeks. And now he said he'll be voting against Amendment 4. So this is an incredibly important time. Now, I understand that people can disagree in good faith on the best way to vote in this election. I have dual citizenship. I can vote in both Canada and the United States. And voting is obviously a sacred duty, and it's an important thing to grapple through. I understand that some people think, well, we've got to vote for the GOP ticket to ensure that a disastrous Harris-Walz administration doesn't take power. I understand that logic completely. But I still think it's so important to be lobbying the Trump-Vance ticket the entire time to ensure that if they do get elected, we're not going to have a pro-abortion party, because that's the way it's trending right now. It's really interesting watching the level of denial among a lot of conservative activists, and it makes no sense to me whatsoever, because I do not understand why they are so obsessed with defending Trump when he says things like this. I get, you know what? I like what Ben Shapiro did, good Trump, bad Trump. When he does something good, praise him. When he does something bad, call him out. We are voters. We are not dedicated or committed to one specific person. And the people who keep on saying, you should be grateful that Trump appointed the justices that overturned Roe. When you cut a deal with somebody and they keep their end of the deal, that doesn't mean you're eternally grateful to somebody. If a salesman tries to sell you a car and you buy the car and you're happy with the car, you're not obligated to buy cars from the same guy for the rest of your life because you liked the product you got the one time you cut a deal with him. And so, yes, I am grateful for what Trump did in his first term. We need to make sure that his second term doesn't look very differently, like he's telling people that it will. And now is the time to speak up. I'll close this segment with a quote from J.D. Vance, who I was a big fan of for many years, and I'm still hoping that his principles win out over the pragmatism that's currently gripped that ticket. He said back in 2022, if you're not willing to stand up to the left on abortion, you can't be trusted on anything else. The pro-life position is the pro-people position, and I'm proud to be 100% pro-life. Some of us still believe that. Thanks everyone for watching that clip. If you'd like to check out our content on other platforms, you can find us on Rumble, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever else you get your content. Be sure to like and subscribe to this channel and spread the clip around if you like the content. Thanks so much.